Non-Christian sources are ultimately either fabricated, like with Josephus, or they just regurgitate what Christians were claiming at the time.
These are some of the mythicists' favorite arguments. Anything that might disagree with their view is an interpolation or doesn't count because the source was ultimately Christian. Both arguments simply are terrible. First, just because a source is a Christian, that doesn't mean it's not trustworthy. It doesn't mean it's not factual or that it's not legitimate. There's no logic in dismissing such sources. More so, simply claiming that the ultimate source must have been a Christian doesn't actually mean it was a Christian. Generally, such a claim is not based on actual evidence, but it's just assumed. In all, it's just a bad argument. Second, let's actually dive into Josephus. Unlike what many mythicists will claim, the vast majority of scholars accept that Josephus wrote about Jesus. There we have two passages. The first, called the Testimonium Flavium, is in Book 18 of the Antiquities of the Jews and is held to be partially authentic, with a few phrases having been added. The second passage, found in Book 20, is almost universally accepted as being authentic. Let's start with a passage in Book 20. Here, Josephus is talking about the downfall of Anunnas, the current high priest. In this passage, in chapter 7, Josephus tells us how Anunnas brought forth a number of individuals and sentenced them to death by stoning. We aren't told the reason as to why they were sentenced, besides the vague notion that they were breakers of the law. Among those who were stoned was, quote, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, unquote. James is the only one specifically mentioned here, but we are told that he is just one of a larger group. Now, there are a number of arguments that people have attempted to use in order to discredit this passage. A common one is that it's an interpolation. There's really no evidence for that, though. Instead, this passage fits well within the naming conventions that Josephus uses. In large part, there has been a moving away from this position, as the idea that this passage was an interpolation is really just too difficult to maintain. Instead, a more focused approach has been taken, where only the phrase, who was called Christ, is thought to have been added. There are a couple of ways people make this argument. The first is to claim that the passage originally read, the brother of Jesus, whose name was James. The thought is that some Christian scribe added a marginal note that identified this Jesus with Jesus Christ, and that marginal note was then accidentally added to the text, leaving us with the phrase, who was called Christ. Yet, there is zero textual evidence for this claim. We have no textual traditions that have this variation. Now, that's not an insurmountable issue. It could be that the text was later standardized. There are a few issues here, though. One, we have to ask, why would a scribe assume this passage was talking about Jesus? While this passage does mention a Jesus who was the brother of a man named James, that in itself isn't striking. Both Jesus and James were exceptionally common names. Two, this would break with how Josephus introduces people. Having an identifier for individuals was necessary, as people during this time were generally known by a single name. So if we look at Josephus, there are over a dozen different Jesuses who are mentioned throughout the text. In order to make sense of this, identifiers were added. So to say that James is simply the brother of some random Jesus doesn't actually tell us anything. Now, those who make this argument tend to recognize this issue. The way that they work around it is by claiming that, in fact, the passage tells us who this Jesus is. The claim they make is that this Jesus is actually the same Jesus that is mentioned later on in the text, a Jesus ben Damnius. So the claim then is that we have this passage that speaks of this individual who is called the brother of Jesus, and then further down, we are finally told who this Jesus is. Yet, Josephus never works in this manner. If this argument is true, one has to assume that in this one case, Josephus switches up his general tactic in exchange for a method that really makes no sense. Because after all, this would mean that we have no idea who this Jesus is until sometime later when he's actually introduced. To solve this, some have suggested that originally the passage that read, brother of Jesus, also included the identifier, Bendamnius. There again is no textual evidence for this, nor does it make sense with what we know about Josephus. We have no other examples where Josephus repeats his identifier for the same person twice in a row. Instead, what we see with Josephus is that he will introduce someone with an identifier and then simply name that person by their name for the rest of the story. So when we look at Josephus, this argument simply doesn't work. Now, 3, if we look at the phrase, who was called Christ, it does not appear to be a Christian phrasing. Part of the reason for this is because it's in past tense, as in, he was, when he was living, called Christ. For Christians, Jesus is Christ. This is what we see in Matthew 1:16 when we have a similar phrase. But instead of being in the past tense, it is said, who is called the Christ. We also see the phrase in Origen's Contra Celsum, but in both cases, the phrase is coming from non-Christians. The first case is from Pilate, where Origen is recounting the situation where Barabbas or Jesus is offered to be freed. Here, Pilate is quoted as saying that Jesus, quote, who is called Christ, unquote. In the second case, Origen is referencing the passage in Josephus. In general, then, this phrasing by Josephus, labeling Jesus as someone who was called Christ, just doesn't appear to be a Christian interpolation. It appears more similar to what someone like Josephus, a non-Christian, would have written. 4. Another argument that is often made here is that this phrase, who is called Christ, is a participle clause, and this should have sparked either a digression or a cross-reference. In essence, the idea is that this sort of phrase would have needed some sort of explanation. This simply is not true, though. We have a number of examples in Josephus where no explanation is ever given. For instance, in Antiquities 14, we are introduced to 10 men who were called the freemen. Why were they called the freemen? No explanation is ever given. We also have a closer example which happens to be in the same book as the James passage. Here, we are told of a Joseph who has become the high priest. Josephus introduces him as Joseph, who was called Cabo. Why is he called Cabo? We have no idea, as it's never explained. 5 and final. Some have objected to the term Christ in general. Similar to the prior point, they say that Josephus either would have had to explain what was meant by Christ, or no one would have understood. That, or Josephus would never have called Jesus the Christ, or the Messiah, because he didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah. To the first point, as we have already went over, Josephus doesn't always explain a nickname. They didn't need to be explained, as they were just a nickname. It was how people referred to that person or place. But one may argue that the term Christ would need to be explained, as it appears that Josephus seemed to be attributing some great importance to this Jesus. This is assuming a bit much. We have to realize that Josephus's audience for the Antiquities of the Jews was largely Greek-speaking individuals, Gentiles. It wasn't written for the Jewish people, so the term Christ here wouldn't necessarily carry any religious overtones. We also have to realize that the term Christ in general wouldn't have necessarily carried religious overtones. While it could have been used to refer to the Jewish Messiah, it could also refer to just an anointed person, or, as we see in Antiquities Book 8, Section 137, it could also just mean plastered, as in, quote, but the other part up to the roof was plastered, Christon, over, unquote. Now, some may object to this, saying that, hey, well, that would be a silly name. But if we actually just look at Roman and Greek names at that time, this wouldn't really stand out. In fact, if we look at Cicero, his name means chickpea. So we could have names that seem silly to us, but they were still known by that name for whatever reason. Now, even beyond that, if Jesus was known as Christ, as he is portrayed throughout Christian writings that predated Josephus, then using that common identifier would not be out of the ordinary. In fact, we would actually expect Josephus to refer to Jesus in a way that would identify him. So when we put this all together, there really is no legitimate reason to doubt the authenticity of the James passage. This then leads us into the Testimonium Flavium. There is slight more disagreement on this passage, but the vast majority of scholars agree that the text, at its core, is authentic. The argument is generally that a few lines were added later on, but those lines can be identified and removed. I must stress this point, as often mythicists will claim that all scholars see the passage as a forgery. That simply is patently false. While there are a couple relevant scholars who doubt the passage, they are in the severe minority. On the other side of the coin, we actually have more scholars who argue that the entire passage is authentic. So no, one cannot argue that it's a forgery because scholars in general see it as a forgery. That simply is not true. Now, when we look at the TF, the Testimonium Flavium, there are really 3 lines that are seen as having possibly been added later. They are, quote, if indeed it is necessary to call him a man, unquote, quote, he was the Messiah, unquote, and, quote, for he appeared to them on the 3rd day, living again, the divine prophets having foretold these things and countless other wonderful things about him, unquote. The first line comes right after Jesus is called a wise man. Josephus calling Jesus a wise man wouldn't have been odd. We see Josephus using the term for other people as well, such as Solomon and Daniel. But the qualifier here, if indeed it is necessary to call him a man, appears a bit odd. In fact, it reads just like that, a qualifier. Now, the phrasing itself isn't odd for Josephus. He uses similar phrasings elsewhere. The larger issue is that the line appears to be saying that Jesus was more than just a mere man. This would be awkward for Josephus. Some have argued that the phrasing was meant to be used sarcastically. This is something that Josephus is known for, such as in his work against Appian, where he called Appian the wonderful Appian. He's being sarcastic here. Another great example is when he says Justice of Tiberias was, quote, the most skillful of writers, unquote. The issue was that Josephus hated justice, so it would be possible to see Josephus as being sarcastic here, while basically mocking the idea that Jesus was thought to be divine. The second phrase here, he was the Messiah, often appears a little bit more straightforward. Josephus, as a devout Jew who never became a Christian, would not have seen Jesus as the Messiah. There are a few issues here though. First, the phrasing is a bit clunky. As discussed previously, it is unlikely that a Christian would have phrased this statement in the past tense, as Jesus having had been the Messiah. If a Christian added it, we would expect the phrase to be, he is the Messiah. We also have a similar passage within the James passage, which again connects Jesus with Christ. Further, in the TF, we also see Josephus saying that the tribe of Christians was named after Jesus. This would make sense if Josephus related Jesus with the term Christ. Stripping Christ from this passage makes a connection with Christians a bit odd. But we have more here. So while we have this main tradition about Josephus, we also have variant traditions. For instance, when we look at Jerome's translation, where he brought it into Latin, we see the phrase as being, quote, he was believed to be Christ, unquote. This fits much more in line with what someone like Josephus would have said. We also have a Syriac variant which states, quote, it was thought that he was the Christ, unquote. This largely agrees with Jerome's version and again fits better within what we would expect of Josephus. The final line, which goes over the idea that Jesus appeared to his followers alive, this does seem a bit much for Josephus. It would appear as if Josephus was affirming the idea of the resurrection. However, this may actually be a misreading. Instead, one could argue that the proper reading is that instead of appearing alive, it was just that, quote, it seemed to them that he was alive, unquote. As in, his followers just thought that they had seen Jesus alive. This would not be a confirmation that Jesus had risen, but instead, people simply thinking that they had seen a risen Jesus. This reading is based on the term phahino, which can be used in either sense, as actually appearing or just seemingly to appear. When looking at how Josephus uses this term, when in conjunction with a participle, he seems to prefer the meaning of it seems to appear. As in, it wasn't something that actually occurred, but only seemed to have occurred. For instance, Josephus relates a story of how the brothers of Joseph put blood on his clothes in order to make it appear that Joseph had been killed by beasts. This was in order to deceive the boy's father, Jacob. Now, for those familiar with the story of Joseph, we know that he was not actually killed, but had been sold. In this context, this reading would make sense as a belief in the resurrection is what caused individuals to continue following Jesus, and what eventually led to Christianity. Reporting this idea, while not confirming that it happened, fits within what Josephus was doing. But let's ignore these three passages and go with the consensus that these three lines were added later on. The rest of the passage is very Josephian. If we break the TF down line by line, we can find numerous parallels within other passages in Josephus's writings, as in the language and style that is present in the TF is also what we would expect of Josephus. A number of the phrases also appear to be more likely to be uttered by Josephus than by a proposed Christian forger. Now, the thing we have to remember with a potential forger is they would have had to add the forgery to Josephus rather late. Most who take this view tend to cite Eusebius as the potential forger, and this would be the time period that we really would have to look at. With that in mind, in the TF, we have the phrase, quote, "And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of the Greek origin," unquote. This may not seem like much to begin with, but there is really only a short amount of time that this idea would have even been relevant. If we look at the development of Christianity, it began as a Jewish sect. The earliest followers are Jews. In fact, Jesus tells his followers not to go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans. It's not until after Jesus died that the movement really began to go out to the Greeks, while also being a Jewish mission. Now, that said, we do have some Gentiles who do appear in the Gospels, but they are a minority. Now, this would change sometime in the early 2nd century when we see Judaism and Christianity splitting. Most scholars point to the First Jewish War and the fall of the temple as one of the catalysts here, and often suppose that by the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the division had largely been finalized. After this, the movement was primarily a Gentile one. By the time of Eusebius, the supposed forger, Christianity was a Gentile religion where Judaism was largely seen as hostile. It then makes more sense to assume Josephus wrote that Jesus attracted many followers among Jews and Greeks than it does for a later writer. Even though the earliest Jesus movement was probably just Jewish, within years of his death, it was attracting both Jews and Greeks, and this is the environment Josephus would have known. In the TF, we also have a much more positive approach to the Jewish leadership. Josephus mentions the Jewish leaders here as, quote, "the principal men among us," unquote. Later Christian writing became increasingly anti-Jewish, to the point where the Jewish leaders are actually the villains. Beyond this, we have other reasons to believe that the TF is at least partially authentic. If the TF was an interpolation, then the placement in Antiquities is odd. The reason for that is that it comes before the passage on John the Baptist. One would assume that if someone was going to add a passage to Jesus into Josephus, they would keep the Christian chronology, which places Jesus after John. In fact, even when Eusebius is giving his summary on the Christian origins, he first cites the John the Baptist passage in Josephus, and then he cites the TF. If Eusebius is doing the interpolation, why wouldn't he have just placed the TF after John if that's how he was going to use it anyways? Now, one of the arguments against the authenticity is that the TF supposedly interrupts the flow of the surrounding passages. This is one argument that I've never really understood. If one is familiar with Josephus, this choppy-like flow is characteristic of his writing. It also isn't uncommon for Josephus to add short little biographies into his work that are often self-contained. When we look at John the Baptist, we see another similar aside. We see this as well with the account of the Egyptian prophet, as well as the magician named Theudius. Often, these little self-contained biographies do relate to the surrounding texts, and we also see that with the TF. Prior to the TF, Josephus finishes one story that features Pilate. We then have the TF, which would have happened in the same general time frame and also deals with Pilate. Then following the TF, we have another new story that features a calamity among the Jews. This is characteristic of the abrupt flow of Josephus. He tells a story, it ends, and then he jumps into something new. Often there's some overall thematic link, but often we also see self-contained stories being added as well. Another argument levied against authenticity is that no one seems to be aware of the TF until the 3rd century. This is true, but it's also very misleading. Alice Wheely, in Josephus on Jesus, traces the use of Josephus's antiquities and shows that it really isn't until the 3rd century that it's used in any way, meaning the TF isn't used until the 3rd century because antiquities wasn't used until the 3rd century. The first person to really utilize antiquities was Eusebius, who focused on Christian history. After the author of Luke and Acts, Eusebius is often seen as the second church historian. Now, Eusebius isn't the first to mention antiquities, though. That would most likely go to Origen. Origen doesn't properly cite antiquities, but it's clear that he references the James passage, and he states that Josephus did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. What should be apparent, though, is that it really isn't a surprise that the TF isn't mentioned, because the antiquities in general isn't mentioned. It was a set of works that just wasn't on anyone's radar. But when the TF is finally mentioned, how is it used? If we take the mythicist position that it was a forgery, one would assume that it was used in order to prove Jesus existed or bolster him in some way, but that assumption would be incorrect. While Eusebius cites the TF 3 times, he never uses the more pro-Christian claims. Instead, he uses it in regards to chronological claims and to show that Jesus had many disciples. In fact, we don't see any early references to the TF that actually highlight the pro-Christian claims. It's not used to suggest that he was truly the Messiah, and in fact, Origen specifically states that Josephus did not think Jesus was the Messiah. They don't use it to suggest that he was divine or overly special. When it is used, it's used in a rather mundane manner. Now, just some final points. Some argue that Eusebius forged the TF because we see similarities in his writings with Josephus. This is expected, as Eusebius uses Josephus quite often. He certainly was going to pick up on at least a few things or phrases. However, the TF also matches with Josephus. At best, then, we can say that Josephus influenced Eusebius. We also have to recognize that Josephus isn't necessarily getting all of his information secondhand. He was a Jew associated with priests and high priests. He was from a respectable family living in Jerusalem. It's quite likely that he was present, or at least knew people who were present, during the incidents with James, where James is killed. It's also very probable that he would have known something about Christians, as the center of their church was in Jerusalem with James, Peter, and John. It's also known that Josephus was acquainted with individuals, or at least families, who would have been involved with the priesthood and Sanhedrin during the time of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying we can know what his sources are, but what I am saying is that we can't simply claim that his sources must have been Christian. After all, Josephus would have had many connections here, and again, it is probable that he knew of the James incidents firsthand. So we need to be careful on what we assume about his sources. Now, I'm sure that I will address Josephus many more times in the future, but I think for now, this really covers most of the bases. Let's finally move on.